You have just spent, I think, 1 year in Europe, in Vienna, and
Yes.
in some other places. What is the most important take you have from this stay in Europe? What's your dominant impression of the state of Europe?
I was very disappointed because most of Europe's leaders are right now simply following whatever the United States says. And whether this is because of their belief in Europe's security, whether it's their belief that the US will punish them if they deviate from the line. The state of European politics is quite bad, and the war has made things worse because Europe is with a dominant narrative like the United States that is basically given by the US security establishment and then repeated in the mainstream media in Europe. So it was, at a political level, really disappointing. At a personal level, it was wonderful. Vienna is a fantastic place. It is the result of decades of social democratic philosophy and ethos and social housing, and we had a fabulous time. And I also came to admire more and more the wise decision of both the Soviet Union and Austria in 1955 to make a very good deal, that the Soviets would leave Austria and the Austrians would declare neutrality, and that this would be the basis going forward. And it proved its great worth, and I tried to sell that approach for free to give the advice to Ukraine repeatedly, but they didn't understand that it's much better to be a neutral Austria than a NATO aspirant partner of the United States. As Henry Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And Ukraine has believed that the U.S. is going to provide security, and what the U.S. is providing is the dismemberment of Ukraine.
Your Austrian neutrality makes us Swiss a little bit proud, because in the constitution of Austria it says they want to have a neutrality Swiss style.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I mean, that Switzerland was the role model for neutrality in Austria. What's your relationship with Switzerland?
And this is, Switzerland, of course, extremely smart, and it served Switzerland very well. It served Austria very well, and ironically, it served Sweden and Finland very well. And they abandoned this this year, shockingly naively, thinking that Russia's about to invade Finland or Sweden. No. And all of the benefits of neutrality they gave up overnight because of these right-wing parties that don't understand or pretend not to understand the current geopolitics.
Even in Switzerland, there are people in the establishment who think that neutrality has to be given up, or neutrality has to be made more flexible, that Switzerland can deliver weapons to one party in the war. What do you say about that? I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, should Switzerland give up neutrality? Would that be a wise course?
No. There's nothing more to add. Switzerland's one of the most successful countries of modern history. Why would you give up the basis of success?
Ja, as Goethe said, nichts ist schwerer zu ertragen als eine Folge von guten Tagen. Good days are hard to bear, and sometimes if you're very successful, you start to forget what made you successful.
Well, it's interesting. Every day I walk by Goethe on the Ringstrasse in Vienna, because he's got a big statue just near the opera house. And so I paid respect to Goethe every day.
Okay. You have been commenting, of course, the war in Ukraine in the recent months extensively. how do you assess the situation at the moment? Give us a brief oversight of your perception.
I think it's probably accurate or roughly accurate that about 40,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 2 months of what is a failed counteroffensive promoted by the United States. So this has been a disastrous period. Ukraine will not achieve on the battlefield its goals. This was clear from the very beginning, but the U.S. has always said otherwise. And remember, I'm 68 years old, so I've heard the fairy tales of U.S. generals for more than 6 decades. They always say, yes, success is just around the corner. This next offensive is going to be great. The surge is going to be decisive, and so forth. So I've heard this so many times in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and heard it again in Ukraine. What's very sad is that Ukraine is being destroyed in this process because the U.S. has wanted to push Ukraine to NATO, and Russia, for completely predictable and understandable reasons, said no. And the United States believed that Russia was bluffing, or that if not bluffing, that it had no alternative but to bend to the U.S. will. And this has not been the case. And Biden is not a very clever man, unfortunately, and his team is not very clever. Obama was more clever than Biden. And Obama knew in 2014, though Obama helped to start this disaster when the U.S. helped to overthrow Yanukovych, Obama knew at that time, don't go deeper into this, because as he said in an interview, Russia has escalatory dominance. Whatever we do, Russia will escalate. And the reason is, for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's nice. Wouldn't it be nice if Ukraine were in NATO? We would control the Black Sea. That's nice. But for Russia, it's absolutely existential. And so Obama already understood in 2014, don't escalate, because Russia will continue to escalate. You can't bluff Russia out of this. Biden, who's not very clever, just thought, well, what will Putin do? We'll just keep pushing. And when Putin put on the table in December 2021 a draft agreement for security arrangements between the US and Russia, by the way, I called the White House to say, negotiate. This is absolutely negotiable. I was told, no, we're not going to negotiate. And the US told Russia, no, not interested in negotiating. NATO is none of your business. It was literally the line. And Putin said, it is my business, and has shown it. And this is a complete disaster for Ukraine. Probably the population has declined by maybe 10 million from emigres on the one hand, or the Russia-controlled territory on the other hand. And the bloodbath continues. And NATO has, I won't even say NATO, this is a small group in the US leadership. They have no answer, but they have the election coming up in November 2024. So they think they need to continue this so as not to show weakness or defeat. This is where we are right now. It's a complete tragedy for Ukraine.
How will it play out? I mean, it's always hard to say, of course, to look into the future, but what is the most probable outcome you see in this war?
There will be ongoing large-scale killing and destruction until honesty prevails. And honesty will mean that the US will be clear that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is not going to take place and not going to happen, and it's not an objective, and then the fighting will stop. And when the fighting stops, there will be major territorial issues. One, I think, was fated from the beginning, and that is that Crimea will remain in Russian hands, as it was and has continued to be Russia's naval base in Sevastopol since 1783. It's not going to Ukraine, other than it's not going to Ukraine, period. And then the issues of the Donbass and Kherson district and Zaporizhia. This is really a mess right now, because in December 2021, we should remember Russia was making no territorial claims, even for the Donbass. What Russia was calling for was honoring the Minsk agreements. And the US stupidly and Ukraine stupidly wouldn't honor agreements that had been signed and backed unanimously by the UN Security Council. Well, Russia is now dismantling the country geographically, and with so many losses on the Russian side, the belief that, well, okay, we'll just go back to where we were is a little naive. So this is a mess. I don't have any clear answer. What I've said every day from December 2021 until now is sit down and negotiate, because it's getting worse. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying at a rate of maybe 1,000 a day right now, or 1,000 dead and seriously wounded. And this is absolutely disastrous.
The dominant narrative, even in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Europe, I don't know, probably also in the United States, is that Putin is trying to reassemble the Soviet Union. His plan is to create a greater Russia, and to negotiate with Putin would be appeasement policy, which was doomed against Hitler. These historical analogies are being made. Why is this narrative wrong in your eyes?
Well, because the real context is that the American empire is the one that keeps expanding, or the intention of it. And by, that's a provocative phrase that Americans are not allowed to say. But the American military alliance, NATO, is the active agent here of expansion. And this counters all that was said to Gorbachev in 1990. It's a direct violation of common sense, as well as commitments that were made back in 1990, that as the Soviet Union dismantled the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage of that in any way. And of course, the famous expression was not 1 inch eastward. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, I was actually in the room in the Kremlin when that happened, because I was advisor to Boris Yeltsin. So this is, for me, not only history books, but being there. The United States, unbeknownst, of course, to me and to the world at the time, because everything is done secretly, said, okay, now we start expanding NATO. And from the early 1990s onward, this was set in motion. And our top diplomats warned repeatedly, don't do that. Our greatest diplomat of the age, George Kennan, after all, the author of Containment itself in 1947, said, do not expand NATO. Our Secretary of Defense at the time, William Perry, said, do not do this. Our ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, a wonderful diplomat, said, do not do this. This will start us down a path of new confrontation. What's interesting is that for the first few years, the first wave of expansion, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I think Russia was very unhappy, but said, okay, That's Central Europe. But then the next swath under George W. Bush Jr. was, of course, right against the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, Slovakia and Slovenia, 7 in one wave. The Russians said, stop this already. And Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. People should read the speech. Of course, not only do they not read the speech, our mainstream media absolutely tried to deflect us from any history, from any memory, from any context. But Putin said, stop expanding. You promised us no expansion. Now you keep expanding. And this is extraordinarily dangerous for our national security, what you're doing. So what was the U.S. response? In 2008, George W. Bush Jr. insisted that NATO will go not only to Ukraine, but to Georgia. Okay, now it turns out this was part of a timeline that was already deeply set. This wasn't just George W. Bush Jr., though he didn't have to follow through. Zbig Brzezinski explained all of this in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1997 in an article called Strategy for Eurasia. He even gave the timetable. He said Ukraine's membership will come between 2005 and 2010. And if you're experienced in US politics, an article in Foreign Affairs like that is not just some author's thinking. It's a reflection of what is in train. Little bit trial balloon, but mainly explanation of the timeline. Now, in 2008, European leaders were aghast at what Bush had done. And some of them talked to me. And
Angela
they told me.
Angela Merkel
not
said,
Angela Merkel personally, no.
But she said at the time, if Ukraine would be part of NATO, this would be a cause for war for Russia. Even Merkel said it.
Exactly. So this was all known. And what is so sad about the European leaders is none of them tells the truth right now. They're all so scared of the United States or of their public or of the ability to manipulate the mass media and the perception from below or to speak out of line. But I know what they said because they said it to me. They said it to me personally. And by the way, just as recently as a few weeks ago, one of Europe's top leaders, I said to him, I won't go farther to say who, but I said, the day Biden says NATO's not enlarging, then we really can get to the end of the war. And he said to me, I agree with you completely. And then he said exactly the opposite the next day, by the way, in public. So I know it from my own view. So this story, just to finish the story, the disaster, the fuse was lit in 2008, but then the U.S. cannot stop playing games. That's the biggest problem. U.S. foreign policy is covert. It's not that you can't figure it out, but it's secret, it's deniable. And so what happens in 2014 in February? The United States, together with right-wing nationalists in Ukraine, worked together to overthrow Yanukovych. Clear as can be. And not only that, thanks to the services of Russia, we even have it on tape with Victoria Nuland talking to U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat about who the next government will be. Basically 4 weeks before Yanukovych is violently overthrown. And they pick the next prime minister and explain why. It can't be Klitschko, it's got to be this one. And it just went down that way. And our newspapers, they won't say a word about it. It's on tape. Oh, that doesn't matter. We can ignore it. We can ignore everything. So that's when the explosion came, the war started with the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Now, so many people, Sachs, what a Putin apologist, what a conspiracy theorist. Of course, people, if you don't look a little bit, or people don't tell you things, then you don't know. But let me advise people, just for example, there's a very nice book written by a very fine scholar in 2017 called Covert Regime Change. And it's about US foreign policy from 1947 to 1989. And it documents 64 covert regime change operations of the US government. So that's the business of the US government, overthrowing other governments. They're called covert, but there's a lot of trace. I've been actually in places where governments have been overthrown. I watched, and then I see that the New York Times won't even report the story because it's a game from the US point of view. So in February 2014, the US again engaged in a regime change operation and thought we can get away with it. Now we have a pro-NATO government. We've just overthrown the neutral government. Now we have a pro-NATO government. And immediately the new government says, yeah, we want to join NATO. And immediately the arms flows start from the United States, billions of dollars of arms flows. And this continues through Trump. It continues through the uprisings in the Donbass. It continues with Russia taking back Crimea. And then in 2021, we have a new president who some of us thought would be sane and responsible. He's probably sane, but he's completely irresponsible. And 3 times in 2021, the United States government recommitted to Ukraine's membership in NATO at the highest levels in big security documents, as well as in the NATO summit in 2021. And that's when Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 a draft agreement for new security arrangements between the US and Russia. And Putin kept saying, by the way, look, you're putting Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. They're a few minutes from Moscow. What are you putting in those missile chambers? We don't even know, because you backed out of the ABM treaty, you backed out of the INF treaty. And so Putin's got a point. And now the US wants to move up to the 2,300 kilometer border with Russia. And for those who still think that this is, anyone who reads anything knows that this is a 30 years process. This is not about Putin reconstructing the Russian Empire. That's a nice little joke told by the US security state, as opposed to any of the things I've just described. But if you just go online and look at the Russian National Security Council meeting of February 21st, 2022, you get a perfectly plain explanation of what this military operation is about, because Putin goes around the room and calls on everybody, and calls on Lavrov, among others, and says, Minister Lavrov, what is the situation with our proposals for security arrangements? And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we put them on the table, and the United States has given us the formal notice that it will not negotiate on these points, and that as a formal principle, the United States will not discuss NATO enlargement with Russia because it's none of our business, because that is the formal foreign policy doctrine of the United States of America. Well, I can't think of a stupider one, by the way, to say that NATO enlargement, with all that it entails, up to Russia's border is none of Russia's business, so we don't even discuss it with Russia. Well, you might think a war could break out as a result of that, and it has. Really, what China, and I think now the others, are looking towards is a way to do business without being vulnerable to the US coming in and freezing accounts or dictating who can do what to whom. the U.S. absolutely, in my view, wrongly, even disastrously militarized the dollar. It said, you can use the dollar, you can't use the dollar. You think those are your foreign exchange reserves? No, we locked them up. The United States, after all, started in 2022 in its sanctions against Russia by freezing $300 billion of Russia's accounts. It also did something completely weird, in my view, and so lawless, I could not have imagined it, which is to say, you're a friend of Putin, you no longer have your apartment. You're a friend of Putin, you no longer have your house. Anyway, it's bizarre that this is even contemplated, much less done to a lot of people. But in any event, the U.S. froze the balances of multiple countries, the Forex balances, foreign exchange reserves. And not only Russia, Venezuela was an extraordinary case. One day, the Trump administration said, Mr. Maduro, you're not president. Juan Guaido is president. Well, how do you know? Because we said so. We create our own reality. And bizarrely enough, on that basis, the United States froze Venezuela's own money. So what's happening right now is countries saying, why are we doing this? Especially countries that, might have a foreign policy disagreement with the United States and don't want to see their economy tanked. So the essence of what they're looking for is how to make settlements that don't go through U.S. banks and therefore that are not subject to the U.S. regulatory reach to freeze a payment. As a monetary economist, my view is this is not very hard. You can settle in multiple ways. And this is the point that they're all making in the BRICS summit, which is why should India and Russia or China and Brazil settle in dollars and be vulnerable to the U.S. Treasury, to CFIUS, to all of these committees that one day to the next can say that's not really your money. They want a reliable payments mechanism. And I think over the next year, that's what they're going to devise. They will settle in renminbi, they will settle in rubles, they will settle in rupees, and they may make a unit of account that's based on perhaps the starting 5 R currencies, the ruble, that's the real, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, and the rand. So it happened that the 5 original BRICS countries are all our currencies, and they talk about a 5R unit of account now. Now they've added the real with Saudi Arabia and with Iran, so maybe it'll be 7 R's in the core basket. It won't be a currency. It may be a unit of account for denomination of contracts and so forth. They could very well create swap lines across the central banks of the BRICS countries. I would imagine that they would do so to ensure liquidity in this system. Just like the SDR can be issued ex nihilo, out of nothing, in the IMF, which basically means that central banks agree to swap their currencies in essence. The same can happen within the BRICS countries. What they will do, in short, is to create alternative payments mechanisms that don't use U.S. banks. Great success for the U.S. They brought it on themselves, absolutely predictably. My view is the role of the dollar is going to diminish tremendously. The whole economics literature is, no, this doesn't happen. This will take decades. No, this will happen quickly because of the politics. I don't mean 1 year to the next, but over the next few years. It'll happen for 2 fundamental reasons. One is that the U.S. militarized the dollar. And the second is that because of digital technologies, the the ways to work around even the banking system in straight digital settlements is absolutely clear right now. So the mechanics of creating a non-dollar transaction system, I think, is much, much better technologically than even 5 years ago.
The other thing I'm going to say, because I think this needs to be said, is that none of this, you said that what's happening to the dollar is not in the interests of the United States. None of this, in my opinion, is in the interests of the United States. The United States is subordinating the prosperity of its own people to the geopolitical objectives that it has to sustain its own hegemony. And I should say, just before we did this program, I was reading 2 articles that you sent us, both written by, they're summaries of articles of the people who are on the Council for Foreign Relations. And they talk about revitalizing the US economy in order to meet the challenge from China. And I have to say, that seems to me an absolutely warped sense of priorities. You don't revitalize your economy in order to meet the challenge from China. If you're going to revitalize your economy, you do it in order to increase the prosperity, the happiness, the sense of contentment in your own country amongst your own people. But that is the mindset that these people seem to have. They subordinate everything to their geopolitical ideas.
It's so well said, Alexander. The main problem in the United States is we have become a plutocracy, massive inequality, a lot of people suffering. No one pays any attention to that. It's not the Republicans, not the Democrats, period. So even when they, quote, revitalize the U.S. economy in the Biden fashion, what are they doing? It's more corporate tax cuts for everything. So everything is basically, we'll give tax cuts for, building semiconductors. We'll give tax cuts for renewable energy, whatever it is. But the whole modus operandi is corporate driven top to bottom. So we're just exacerbating the inequalities. And the real telltale point of all of this is not the GDP, it's life expectancy, which has been falling for a decade in the United States now. We're back to the life expectancy of the mid-1990s. People in the United States are ill. They're not getting taken care of. They don't have access to decent nutrition. They don't have access to healthcare services. That's not even on the agenda. What's on the agenda? The war in Ukraine, Taiwan weaponry, fighting China. So you put it exactly right.
Was Yellen's visit really about asking China not to dump treasuries? How did the U.S. expect it to succeed after Biden insulted Xi? What leverage does the U.S. have to make it happen?
Of course, I don't know what was said in the room. I've known our Treasury Secretary for 50 years because in 1973, 50 years ago, I sat in a classroom when a wonderful young professor from Yale came and taught me macroeconomics. So I go back 50 years with Janet Yellen, and she's a very decent and wonderful person. The message that she carries comes from an administration that I am not very sympathetic to. And my advice to this administration was, if you go to say we're not out to undermine your economy, the first thing you should say is we will not impose more unilateral measures before we negotiate with you. In other words, stop the unilateralism. That was the recommendation I made. It was obviously not followed because just after Secretary Yellen's trip, Biden signed a new executive order cutting off more technology to China. So the message that that Secretary Yellen carried, that we're not aiming to derail, we don't want to decouple and so forth. Whatever it was undermined immediately afterward by the actions of the Biden administration, which took yet another step to try to undermine China. And however much they say, oh, we're not trying to undermine China, of course they're trying to undermine China. It's plain as can be. And so they should stop that. If they want to have actual normal relations with China, the first thing you do is stop putting on unilateral measures and start really talking, not in one trip, but in actual discussion and negotiation. And that doesn't happen till this day. The Biden administration came in, and whether it is the neocon ideology, which is pervasive with Biden, whether it was fear of Trump that he won the Midwest states with an anti-China protectionist election platform, probably both of those, Biden came out blazing anti-China. And also a point that Alexander made, and I think should be reiterated, the trash talking is nonstop about China. So Secretary Yellen goes, soon after President Biden says, well, President Xi's a dictator. Come on. Or bad things happen to bad people. You know, this is also Biden. He's a kind of got in a really obnoxious side, and he thinks that he's real tough when he's speaking to the donors to show how macho he is. So these are all stupid statements coming out of donor sessions, and Biden always likes to swagger. An 80-year-old guy swaggering in this pathetic way is really pathetic, but it's trash talk. And so I don't know what was said inside, but I can say that it cannot be successful to have any kind of normal relations with this kind of unilateral behavior. And it's amazing. I was just rereading one of the articles by the Council on Foreign Relations, which says, in this sense, there is no real prospect of building fundamental trust, peaceful coexistence, mutual understanding, a strategic partnership, or a new type of major country relations between the U.S. and China. Rather, the most that can be hoped for is caution and restrained predictability. In other words, the U.S. position always is, we don't want to have trust. We don't want to have anything. We don't necessarily want to have war, though sometimes they do. But it's going to be bad. You know, we're going to be tough. Even saying the idea of fundamental trust or peaceful coexistence, don't even think about it. That's the real American attitude. Don't have a real discussion with Chinese counterparts.
The West is hurting China by going belly up and no longer being able to buy Chinese exports. The problem is China has not been able to substitute U.S. demand. What do you think about that statement?
Well, it's not that the West can't buy Chinese exports. It's stopped because of high tariffs and barriers and threats to U.S. companies and warnings, don't go there and don't produce goods in China for resale to the U.S. market and so forth. So the idea is stop demand for Chinese products, throw China into a Japan kind of crisis. And indeed, China has to find other markets, and the world is big. And that is what China is doing, which is saying, okay, we are not going to beg to get into a U.S. market for a country that evidently can't even think about peaceful coexistence. We have to find our way in the world. And what China is doing is forging economic cooperation with most of the rest of the world. And most of the rest of the world means ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. It means African countries. It means West Asia, the Gulf countries. It means Central Asian countries, the STANs. It means South American countries. And China has several initiatives. The best known is the Belt and Road Initiative, which basically says we save a lot. The Chinese have a very high saving rate. We can provide finance for our partners, our counterpart countries, to really upgrade infrastructure, upgrade fast rail, for example, upgrade 5G, upgrade ports, upgrade renewable energy, upgrade long distance power transmission. So the Belt and Road Initiative is promoting Chinese exports, but like trade, it's mutually beneficial for the other side, which builds, excuse me, infrastructure. And I think that this is the path for China that will be successful, which is if the US closes itself to China's goods, export elsewhere. The world is a very large place, and it needs China's technology. It needs China's capacity to produce large-scale, low-cost infrastructure. If you ride the maglev or Chinese fast rail or Chinese 5G, it's good stuff. And the rest of the world wants that. And the United States, by closing the US market, well, it'll cost the US. But China has alternatives. And I think that that's what we will see and what the BRICS enlargement is about.
All right, let's do one more for the professor. From Ralph Steiner. This is an interesting one. Might Jeffrey give us his opinion as to why Ethiopia was added? What does Ethiopia add to the BRICS?
Yeah, very interesting. Ethiopia is 120 million people. It is a very significant culture. It has actually been a very fast-growing country for the past 15 years. China and Ethiopia have pretty deep relations, actually, and China built massive hydropower for Ethiopia and also rail for Ethiopia, which is making a very big difference. The criterion for BRICS enlargement principally was systemically important countries. And interestingly, of course, China looks ahead. We always look backward, and with also tremendous disdain mixed with a strong dose of racism. We think Ethiopia, what's that? But Ethiopia in 20 years will look very, very different. It'll be much richer. It's dynamic. It actually has a culture that is very deep and goes back to Herodotus in the 5th century BCE with the and onward, and China gets it. I think it was very clever for China to focus on Egypt and on Ethiopia, two ancient civilizations, both very sizable, both very interesting places with deep cultures, and I think strong national visions of development, and therefore good partners for China and for the BRICS more generally. It's so good to hear some wisdom coming from Europe, because unfortunately the dominant discourse in Europe is like the dominant discourse in the United States these days, which is war all the time. And I've always counted on Europe to be smarter than the US on these matters, because the US makes so many of these awful, unnecessary wars. And I've been surprised and very alarmed and disappointed by the European leaders falling into line with the U.S. military-industrial complex. And Claire, thank you. It's just so good to hear your wonderful remarks. It's gotten very bad in Europe, as it has in the United States. Very hard to reach the mainstream because the media, the corporate media, have completely blocked out any honest accounting of how we got into the Ukraine war and what's happening and why it's a disaster. So it's very hard to even share basic facts right now. I know I was pretty frequently on just normal mainstream TV, but not these days, not in the last couple of years, because nobody wants to hear. And I begged the New York Times even for one editorial to tell the truth about this war. And I kind of badgered them into accepting something, and they accepted it. They edited it. They were getting ready to print it. And then they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Professor Sachs, we're not going to run it after all." So the fact of the matter is the corporate mainstream media is just completely saturated with the US government propaganda. So with that backdrop, here we are sharing some truth and sharing some thoughts together. I go back more than 30 years in Russia, Ukraine, US, European issues, because more than 30 years ago, I was trying to help President Gorbachev, and then trying to help President Yeltsin, and then trying to help President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, to overcome all of the huge difficulties that attended the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed because it was a miserable system. It didn't work. And Gorbachev knew it, and he wanted a normal society with normal relations with the US, and he wanted a common European home, and I loved the man for it. And when he asked me to be on his advisory team, of course, I said yes. And I learned that the United States could not take yes for an answer. It could not accept the idea of just a normal, cooperative relationship with a reformed Soviet Union or with an independent Russia. The US wanted unipolarity. The US wanted dominance. The US wants its way on everything. It's crazy. We're 4.2% of the world. We don't and can't and shouldn't aspire to run the world. We should aspire to cooperate. Well, I saw firsthand in a very painful few years that the US doesn't like cooperation. First, it was the Bush senior administration. Well, that was Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, the neocons of the day. And they basically didn't want to lift one finger to help the transformation of Russia into a new independent state that was peacefully integrated with its neighbors. Of course, they told lies. Gorbachev unilaterally said that he would disband the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And James Baker III, our Secretary of State at the time, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, ran to Gorbachev. If you do this, we will absolutely not take advantage of the Soviet Union. We will absolutely not move NATO into where the Warsaw Pact is right now. We will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And there's a massive, wonderful archive of material with this promise repeated many times to Gorbachev by the Germans, by the US, by the Secretary General of NATO himself to a visiting Russian delegation. Well, turned out all to be lies, because as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991, the neocons started planning the expansion of NATO, because they couldn't take yes for an answer that we should just have peace and cooperation. They needed the expansion. And who championed the expansion? Of course, the military-industrial complex led the lobbying. And it's not even subtle. The Raytheon top lobbyist was the head of the committee for the expansion of NATO. Well, duh. this was money. We can sell weapons. We can expand our military bases. We can expand our military budget. And of course, these neocons had the idea that they would make several wars of choice. They actually decided that already in the 1990s, that there would be several wars of choice because there was no one to oppose it. So the US could depose all of the governments that were still aligned with Russia. That means the Syrian government, the Libyan government, Saddam Hussein, and so forth. And they would find whatever excuse, whatever lies, whatever alleged provocations to launch wars of choice. And of course, we know that this happened. But the real origin of the Ukraine war was this relentless NATO march eastward, despite the core promises that were made and the core common sense, by the way, not just the promises. Why provoke Russia? And when Clinton actually started the machinery of NATO enlargement, his own Secretary of Defense, William Perry, thought about resigning in protest because he thought it was such a terrible idea that this would just lead to a new Cold War, just at the time that relations were being normalized. And our top diplomats knew this. They understood this. Jack Matlock, the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, said, don't expand NATO. You said no, and it's only going to provoke. Excuse me. Oh, God, I get choked up over this. George Kennan, our top historian diplomat, the person who invented containment, that concept of the 1940s, he never wanted to be militarized in this way. And he absolutely said, this is the biggest mistake imaginable to start expanding NATO. Well, I watched a lot of this pretty close up. Clinton, kind of as usual, not thinking very much, very short-term thinking, started the NATO expansion in the 1990s. That was to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. The Russians were very unhappy, but it wasn't a big crisis. It wasn't on their border. Then Bush Jr. comes in, all the wars of choice. And not to mention, by the way, in 1999, Clinton bombs, and not Clinton only, NATO bombs Belgrade for 6 straight weeks. Not exactly to Russia's liking, absolutely horrible. And that worsened the relations further. Then in 2002, the neocons under Bush Jr. called for the unilateral US withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Unbelievable. The Russians said, stop, don't do this. This puts us in a threat. This destabilizes the nuclear deterrence, which is our basis for just peacefully being able to trust each other and keeping on a path of denuclearization. Well, the US unilaterally withdraws and starts planning for placing missiles near Russia. And the Aegis missiles go into Poland and Romania within the next decade. Well, the Russians are really getting pretty upset about this. And then George W. expands NATO to 7 more countries in 2007. The 3 Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And Putin goes to the Munich Security Summit in 2007 and says, come on, stop. You promised not 1 inch eastward, and now it's 10 countries you've expanded to. So the US, in its infinite wisdom as usual, what does it do? The next year, George W. Bush Jr., with, by the way, our U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Victoria Nuland. I hope that name rings a bell. She's currently our Deputy Secretary of State. They call for NATO to enlarge further. And where? To the 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, Ukraine, and to Georgia. Georgia, not the state, Georgia, the country, on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Look at a map, it ain't a North Atlantic country. But what it is a plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because the idea was, and it was a very premeditated US idea, that with NATO enlargement, NATO would be in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And notably, Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. And that was the idea. That, by the way, was the same idea of Lord Palmerston in 1853. So it's not a very original idea. It was the whole basis of the first Crimean War. And so these neocons wanted to fight the second Crimean War. And of course, you could hear the cheers of Britain, which is imperialist nostalgia to the essence in its political class. Yes, yes, yes. We can surround Russia and the Black Sea just like Lord Palmerston wanted to do a century and a half earlier. Well, Putin says, do not do this. This could be incredibly destabilizing. But by the way, it wasn't just Putin who sent a secret memo back from Moscow to Washington to Condoleezza Rice. Well, of course, none other than Bill Burns. Bill Burns was then the US ambassador to Russia. But you may recall the name. He's currently our CIA director. And he sent a secret memo, because everything in the US government is secret, by the way. He sent a secret memo entitled Niet means Niet. And he explained something so basic, so obvious, that for Russia, this is a absolute hardcore bright red line. Do not go to Ukraine. And that it's not just Putin, it's the entire Russian society. They don't want the US military bases. They don't want Aegis missiles. They do not want to be crowded on their border by the US military. And it makes perfect sense because we wouldn't like it either. But, you know, American security state leaders who don't ask us Americans, they're a little hard of hearing. So, did you say red line? We didn't hear that. So, of course, Bush pushes through the commitment by NATO to expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. I know European leaders told me in 2008, what is your president doing? But Europe, you know, they're, I don't get it exactly, but they will not oppose the US in public. So they complained to me, but then they, in the end, signed on to Bush's crazy idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. Now, there was one last safety valve to understand in this, and that is the Ukrainians did not want this. Ukraine is a divided society, ethnically Ukrainian, ethnically Russian. They didn't want this crowding. They knew that this would destabilize the situation. So the elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, we will be neutral. We will not alarm Russia. Also, we'll extend a lease in Crimea for the Sevastopol naval fleet until 2042. We want quiet. The United States neocons don't like quiet. They want just to get their way. So in the end of 2013, they helped stoke first protests against Yanukovych, and then the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014. And we know that Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden all played a role in the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian president. That's just a fact. Now, so much is hidden from view that we don't know exactly time and date, but the Russians intercepted one of Victoria Nuland's phone calls and posted it on YouTube so everybody can listen to it, as she and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, plot the next post-Yanukovych government several weeks before a violent storming of the government buildings in Kiev. That's what happened. That's when the war started. We overthrew the government that wanted stability. And in came a series of governments that were Russophobic and pro-NATO and at the American service. And Obama and Trump and Biden pumped in arms. Now, just to finalize how we came to this current utter tragedy and disaster. When Biden came in, I had hopes, okay, maybe something rational. No way. Biden doubled down on Ukraine becoming a NATO member, doubled down repeatedly in 2021, said NATO will enlarge to Ukraine. And on December 17th, 2021, Putin, really at wit's end, because he could not get the US to engage in diplomacy, put on the table, and you can find it on the internet, a draft US-Russia security agreement to avert a war. And at the time, the security agreement said, don't expand NATO, don't put your missiles close to our borders, and implement the Minsk II agreement, which is a United Nations Security Council-backed agreement for autonomy of the Russian-speaking regions in the east of Ukraine, which the Ukrainian nationalists blew off, and the United States said, yeah, don't worry about it. You don't have to follow through on a UN Security Council agreement. And Putin said, honor that agreement. Well, the basic story is, of course, the US refused to negotiate on these points. And on February 21st, 2022, there was a Russian Security Council meeting. You can find the minutes online again in the Russian government in English transcription or translation. President Putin calls on the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, give us a report on your diplomatic initiatives in regard to our security. And Lavrov says, the United States has formally notified us that the NATO enlargement issue is non-negotiable, that it's none of our business. That was the final step before the Russian invasion on February 24th. We rejected every single diplomatic chance to avoid a war. And we thought, okay, our wonderful weapons and our financial sanctions will do Russia in. And by the way, you know, I've been observing these kinds of things for 40 years. I wrote an article, it was, I think in June actually, so it was a couple months after this, saying that these neocon ploys are doomed to fail. The sanctions aren't going to kill the Russian economy. The wonder weapons are not going to defeat Russia and so forth. So obvious if you've seen this particular show repeatedly, as we have, all the promises of our generals and the military industrial complex and all the rest, wrong again and again and again. But what we did do was trap Ukraine in a devastating war between the US and Russia. So we provide the weapons, we provide, and I'll put it in quotation marks, the intelligence, because it's not very intelligent intelligence. And we tell them run to the front lines, and tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died just in recent weeks because of this. An absolutely predictable bloodbath. And when the Ukrainians tried to negotiate with the Russians in March 2022, just after the start of the invasion, the US stopped the negotiations. And when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, said last fall, maybe this is the time to negotiate, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who steps up? Secretary Nuland, the endless neocon. Doesn't matter whether she's working for Cheney, whether she's working for Hillary, whether she's working for Biden, she's the perpetual neocon. She says, no, the time's not right for negotiations. What is the subtext of that? Well, a lot more Ukrainians have to die. And that's where we are right now. And this administration doesn't know what to do because all its great plans backfired, but Biden doesn't want to look weak. He's, facing an election next year. So as usual, they just tell the Ukrainians, just keep running into the Russian lines. Just keep dying. It is the cliche, fight to the last Ukrainian. And we even have senators like Romney say, this is great. What's the problem? No Americans are dying. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what Romney says and what a lot of American leaders are saying. Yeah, we could put in $100 billion. What is that among friends in the military-industrial complex? Of course, it means a lot to Americans who might care about their sustenance. But what they really think is, if the Ukrainians are ready to die for this, it weakens Russia and so forth. And that's where we are till now. So my conclusion, we could have avoided this war entirely. We could have avoided loss of territory. We could have avoided everything because there was no demand for any of this until the US pushed and pushed and pushed and is tone deaf, can't hear anyone else, doesn't believe anyone has red lines except the United States, and is on the path to do the same thing with Taiwan right now. And that's the war talk. So we're not out of this by any means. We're still in the midst of this neocon-dominated American foreign policy. It's what Kissinger famously said, to be a foe of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. So we embrace our friends like Ukraine to the point of their destruction. And now we're angling or threatening or escalating in our tensions with China for a war over Taiwan. Unbelievable. I was just in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago. What a wonderful and beautiful place, and very successful. And we are stoking a crisis by feeding it with armaments. So sorry to have talked so long, but thank you for being the voices for peace and sanity and rationality in this country. Biden's asked for another 20 plus billion. This is our moment to say, stop it already. Your reelection, actually, Mr. Biden, doesn't count compared to the lives you are wasting, the tens of thousands who will die because you don't want an embarrassment on your watch. It's not going to help your campaign to be in a war next year. Nobody wants this in the United States. We don't like this. This is dangerous. This is unnecessary. We don't support you, Mr. President, in this. So stop now. It'll be a lot worse in your campaign. The whole concept that you have to look tough and strong for your 2024 reelection is a nonsense. and it's profoundly immoral. So we need to raise our voice now. I think more and more congressmen and senators are getting the idea that while they don't ask us our opinions in the United States about these issues, because it's not really about what Americans think, it's about what the military-industrial complex demands, we don't like it one bit. Greetings to all of the participants in this very important conference. I think there is no more important activity for us than the pursuit of peace. As we speak, we know that Ukraine is suffering, and tens or hundreds of thousands of people will die in the coming weeks and months if the war continues on its current trajectory. Indeed, the whole world is at threat because this war could escalate to a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Have no doubt that we are on a continuing path of escalation. Peace through negotiation is not only possible, but it was nearly achieved, though, alas, our mainstream media in the US and Europe don't report basic facts anymore. Peace through negotiation was almost achieved in March 2022, just after Russia's invasion. Because in March 2022, the Ukrainian government and the Russian government exchanged documents and negotiated an agreement with the mediation of the government of Turkey and the informal mediation of then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett of Israel. This agreement was nearly reached and signed, and though you cannot find it in the press, the United States stopped the negotiations. It's very important to understand that. It's very hard to understand that through the wall of falsehoods and the wall of deception that surrounds this whole war in the West. The United States has not wanted a negotiated end to the war. And if we return from March 2022 to 3 months earlier, a negotiated settlement before the war was absolutely possible, again, not reported in our media. On December 17, 2021, President Vladimir Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement. At the core of that agreement was that NATO would not enlarge to Ukraine and to the 2,000-kilometer border of Russia. This was not only a concession that the United States should have made to avoid war. It was in America's interest, in Ukraine's interest, in Russia's interest, and in the world's interest. The idea that the United States should push its military alliance, its weapon systems, its bases up to the Russian border is mind-boggling in its recklessness. President Putin put a proposal on the table. I called the White House soon afterwards and beseeched the White House to negotiate on that basis. I explained to the White House how would the United States feel if Russia had bases in Mexico or China had bases in Mexico. The last time that was tried, the United States invaded the said country, which was Cuba. 60 years ago. The White House told me the US will not negotiate with Russia over the enlargement of NATO. I said there will be war if there is not proper diplomacy. The White House did not want to avoid this war through diplomacy. It either thought that it could call the bluff of President Putin or have the war and accomplish what our defense secretary, better to say our war secretary, Lloyd Austin, publicly stated, and that is that the goal of this war is to weaken Russia. If the Ukrainians die and if Ukraine is destroyed in the middle, that's what a proxy war is. All my life, 68 years, I have witnessed US proxy wars in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Nicaragua, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and now in Ukraine. The United States is not thinking about Ukraine. It's thinking about weakening its adversary, or its perceived adversary, Russia. So diplomacy was stopped by the United States in March 2022. It was rejected by the United States in December 2021, and it was rejected by the United States between 2014 and 2021, because when the Minsk I agreement and Minsk II agreements were signed, the United States supported the government of Ukraine to not honor the agreement that Ukraine had signed. The purpose of the Minsk II agreements was to ensure the language and cultural rights of the people of the Donbass or Eastern Ukraine, overwhelmingly Russian ethnicity, with a system of autonomy, which the government of Ukraine agreed to, and in which France and Germany were to be the guarantors, and in which the entire UN Security Council unanimously backed. And the Ukraine government said, no, we don't want to implement what we have signed. The United States said, fine, we will send you arms. You don't have to implement that, even though the UN Security Council had signed. So, in fact, the rejection of diplomacy goes back to late 2014 and early 2015. But in fact, the US rejection of diplomacy goes back even further. It goes back to February 2014, because in February 2014, again, never explored in our mainstream media, but obvious to anybody paying attention, the United States conspired to overthrow the government of Viktor Yanukovych, who was pursuing the path of neutrality in Ukraine. And if that sounds shocking, please go back and listen to the conversation between the then Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and the then US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, which took place 3 weeks before the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych regime. In that call, Victoria Nuland described who would be the post-Yanukovych government. Again, I'm 68 years old. I have lived through dozens of US regime change operations all over the world. I've seen some with my own eyes. And this one I saw very close up. And of course, there was a violent insurrection 3 weeks after the intercepted call, and the government that was brought into place was exactly the one that Victoria Nuland, as Assistant Secretary of State, had described on the call to the US ambassador. I was in Kiev soon afterwards. I learned firsthand how US funding from so-called NGOs had paid for a lot of the so-called Maidan revolution. This was the trigger of the war that really started 9 years ago. Again, it was a rejection of diplomacy by the United States because the sitting president of Ukraine wanted neutrality, whereas the US government wanted NATO enlargement. That means that this conflict actually dates back even earlier to 2008. We can go, because in 2008, George Bush put on the table that NATO would enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia. If you look at a map, the US plan is absolutely clear and follows a line that had been spelled out a decade earlier by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor to Carter and one of the leading US geostrategists. The idea was to encircle Russia in the Black Sea region, because with Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, Russia would be encircled by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia in the Black Sea. The idea, clearly stated, was to bottle up Russia so that Russia was no longer any problem to US policy. Where did the US want a free hand? It wanted to be able to replace governments at will in the Middle East. For example, overthrowing Saddam Hussein in 2003, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, a NATO exercise, by the way, not just a US exercise, but a NATO exercise, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad in 2011. This is another point that's misunderstood. Bashar al-Assad and the so-called Syrian civil war is a US regime change operation gone terribly wrong. The idea was that the CIA would work with the regional governments to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. It failed. Several years later, Russia came to the assistance of its ally, and then our media pointed the finger at Russian intervention, ignoring the US intervention beforehand. There has been almost no reporting about the basic fact of Operation Timber Sycamore, which was an order by President Obama that the CIA would overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I know a lot of this also directly from people who were absolutely involved and trying to stop the war, but the United States opposed diplomacy. We can keep winding the clock back to truly understand what this is about. The US at every stage has rejected diplomacy, and it goes back to actually 1990. In 1990, incidentally, I was an economic advisor to President Mikhail Gorbachev's economic team. Gorbachev wanted peace in Europe. He wanted a common European home. At that time, the United States and Germany promised explicitly that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That was a lie and a phony promise. Gorbachev disbanded the Soviet-led military alliance, Germany reunified, and by 1992, the United States was already planning the massive expansion of NATO all the way to Ukraine. Historians are finding in the archives that the plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine dates back to 1992. Incidentally, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in 1997 in Foreign Affairs a very clear article that lays out the explicit timeline for NATO enlargement, saying that between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine would join NATO. And of course, the invitation pushed by the United States came in 2008, just on Brzezinski's timeline. And note, this is well before Putin. This is well before any supposed threats coming from Russia. This was US military expansion planned for 3 decades now, and nothing is to stop it. Not diplomacy, not negotiation, not avoidance of war, not any truth-telling in the newspapers. And while the Standard may call this a propaganda event, I would welcome a public discussion with the editor of the Standard at any moment to discuss these issues. Because these are facts. This is the history. This is not what's reported in our mainstream media now. Our mainstream media makes a false narrative that this war started with a, quote, unprovoked invasion on February 24th, 2022 by Putin. That is the official Western narrative. The New York Times has repeated that claim 26 times in its editorials and its op-eds, but it never allows anyone to tell the real history in the pages to the readership. And this is what's happening all over the US and all over Europe. We're talking to ourselves. We are leading to the destruction of Ukraine because there is no way in the world to have a military victory over Russia with NATO enlargement as the end result, because Russia will continue to escalate as needed. Perhaps Russia will simply defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. That is quite possible. But if not, Russia will escalate. And Russia has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. President Obama, though he contributed to this overthrow of Yanukovych, was also very clear in 2014, do not get into a war over this issue, because as he put it then, Russia has escalatory dominance, meaning they can always raise the stakes up to and including nuclear war. We are on a reckless path based on falsehoods. This war could have been avoided at countless stages in the last 30 years. This war should never have broken out 9 years ago, because the United States should never be part of violent overthrows of other governments, but it's a bad habit of the United States. Europe should have enforced the Minsk II agreements, backed by the UN Security Council, signed by Ukraine, instead of ignoring them, laughing at them. But the United States said, no, you don't have to follow those. We will arm you. The United States should have negotiated at the end of 2021. The United States should have applauded rather than stopped the negotiations in March 2022. So till today, there is a negotiating path that has been on the table. At the core is neutrality of Ukraine to keep the two nuclear superpowers away from each other. It's common sense. It is what the United States has demanded for 2 centuries in the Western Hemisphere. If the US neoconservatives were not so arrogant, reckless, and blind, it would have been agreed a long time ago. Till this moment, it is possible. NATO, however, which is a US military alliance, insists that no third country, that is Russia or anybody else, has any right to have any say to where the US military alliance goes. That is reckless, and it leads to war. And now have no doubt about the US irresponsibility, which is trying to place NATO offices in Asia. I think not even remembering that it's not the North Asia Treaty Organization, it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is not an expeditionary force for US hegemony. It was meant to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. And yet the United States is trying to expand NATO now to Asia to fight China. Europeans are aghast, but the media are not explaining what this is about. And they are certainly not telling the truth that the war in Ukraine is a disaster that came from the unrelenting arrogance of the United States to keep pushing, provoking, and to avoiding every possibility of a diplomatic off-ramp. So let us help people to understand that negotiations till this moment are feasible, and that President Biden needs to step forward and say NATO will stop its enlargement if Russia leaves and ends the fighting. And this will be the basis for peace. Let me close by noting that today exactly is the 60th anniversary of the greatest speech by any US president on peace, John F. Kennedy's peace speech, given June 10, 1963, at the height of the Cold War. And what President Kennedy said is precisely relevant to us today. At the height of the Cold War, he had the clarity, the honesty, the eloquence, and the leadership to say that the Soviet Union did not want war, the United States does not want war, we can negotiate peace. And President Kennedy called on Americans to reconsider their attitudes to the Cold War and to the Soviet Union. President Kennedy said we should hail the Russian people for their vast achievements in science and industry and culture. At the height of the Cold War, he dared to say this. He knew that the military-industrial complex opposed him. He knew the generals resented a peace initiative, but the American people overwhelmingly supported it. And 5 weeks after President Kennedy's brilliant speech, which everybody can listen to online, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And President Kennedy made a campaign in the United States over the heads of the military-industrial complex to speak directly to the American people that peace is possible, that the US and the Soviet Union have a mutual interest in peace, that an agreement on peace will be in the interest of both sides and enforced by both sides. And President Kennedy carried the day when the Senate voted 80-19 to ratify the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That is leadership. That is an expression of the true common good. That is what is possible today. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's exactly the right analogy. When did World War I start? Did it start on June 28th with the assassination of the Archduke? Did it start on July 28th with the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia? Did it start 10 years earlier when military alliances were secretly made that led to the triggering of disaster? Of course, there are roots to any conflict. And even the dating that we give to the Ukraine war in most of the Western media is simply false on its surface, but it also disguises the antecedent causes. This war started in February 2014. We say it started in February 2022, typically, that Putin, without provocation, because he's a madman and wanted to recreate the Russian Empire in his fantasies, launched an unprovoked war on February 24th, 2022. That's just propaganda. That's not even factual about when the fighting started, because the fighting started in 2014. Not in 2022, and it raged, actually, between 2014 and 2022. So even the simple fact of when the war started was that it started 8 years earlier. And of course, why the war started 8 years earlier is heavily contested, but I'll give you my 5-minute view, and that is that from 1990 onward, we failed to endorse, adopt, and build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, and instead the U.S. set up a vision of a U.S.-led unipolar world and believed that the Cold War was won by a U.S. victory rather than achieved by a diplomatic settlement. In fact, the U.S. did not defeat the Soviet Union. Gorbachev unilaterally said we should end the Cold War. We want to reform. We're going to disband the Warsaw Pact because we don't want to address our issues through military means. And he was told in 1990, okay, if you do that, Germany wants to reunify, but we commit to not expanding our military alliance, NATO, in place of what was the Warsaw Pact. And a famous promise was made that we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And by the way, I always like to say in my talks, if you want documentary evidence, my email is sachs@columbia.edu, and I'll be happy to refer you to the archival material that documents this, because this is all denied now by the United States, which likes a politics of amnesia rather than a politics of memory in this case. So the U.S. promised no NATO enlargement. By 1992, the neoconservatives in the United States, which means the hawkish or war party, was in power. Remember Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, and then they were followed by the Democratic Party side of the war party, which is Madeleine Albright, Richard Holbrooke, and others. So it's both parties. It's not one party or another party. They said, no, we won. It's a unipolar world. Anyway, Soviet Union's finished. We don't have any commitments to keep. And so Bill Clinton started the NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s. And really smart people knew at the time, this is reckless. This is dangerous. It's a cheat, and it's also a provocation. And so that went on for a long time. By the way, when President Putin came to power in 1999, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. He expected cooperation. But he said, stop the NATO enlargement because, you know, we have interests and we don't want your military on our border. Then came 9/11. The neocons went into absolute preeminence. Cheney basically ran the security state of the United States from 2001 to 2008. He was a very dangerous person. He said if there's 1% risk of something, you have to treat it like it's 100% chance. You know, if Saddam has 1% chance of having nuclear weapons, you have to treat it like it's certainty. That's a little crazy, by the way, in decision analysis. You don't treat a 1% as 100%, but you do create a lot of wars if you do that. So all the wars started. And the NATO enlargement continued in 2004, 7 more countries: the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2007, Putin said, no more. So George W. Bush in 2008 said, yes, more. Ukraine and Georgia. This was not prudent. Prudence, prudentia, is a Latin word meaning practical good judgment. And it comes from a Greek word called sophrosony, which means wisdom. This is not wisdom. This is stupid. And that's what they announced in Bucharest 2008. And many European leaders said to me at the time, what is he doing? We're against this. But one thing, this is the continuing slide into this, and I'll just finish with 2 quick points on this. In 2014, the US helped overthrow the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. We know it from many means. I know it because I happen to see things that I wish I hadn't seen. But the US was part of this overthrow. Putin didn't like that either, because Yanukovych was actually rather cleverly trying to balance 2 giants. On the one side, the West saying you must do this and you must do that. On the other side, Russia saying you must do this and must do that. And Yanukovych's position was, we're neutral, thank you, we're neutral. That was rather intolerable to the United States. Neutrality doesn't work in the US mindset, because you're either with us or you're against us. And so they helped to overthrow him in February 2014. That's when the war started. And between 2014 and 2021, there was fighting the whole time, but the US put in billions of dollars of weaponry. And the Ukrainians built fortifications along this line that we're seeing, the front line. That didn't just start a few months ago. That was 8 years of fortifying the eastern Ukraine with American finance and know-how and weaponry. So at the end of 2021, after Biden had come into office, Putin said, look, you crossed every red line, but our red line is NATO stops its enlargement. You stop trying to get military bases on our borders. You stop putting weapon systems that can hit us in a few minutes, and we discuss it. And the White House answer was, nothing to discuss. And we're certainly not going to talk about NATO enlargement. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th, 2022. So if ever there was a series of missed opportunities over 30 years to avoid a conflict, this is it. And that's why I'm deeply unimpressed by an analysis that said this war started on February 24th, 2022 by an unprovoked attack by President Putin. It's just not true. It started because of a buildup of conflict over a 30-year period and lots of cheating, I'm afraid, by the United States side. And that brings us to our mess right now.
So we are, Jeff, where we are right now, and obviously this angle is something that is fiercely opposed by official capital views of the European Union and Washington as well. But the fact of life is that a set of very harsh economic sanctions were imposed on the Russian Federation unilaterally by the United States and the European Union. And as both economist and an intellectual, what's your take on these sanctions? How effective?
Those are opposites, by the way, economist and intellectual.
Intellectual. Well,
Just
try
to make the point.
try to be both in answering this, but and why do you think that majority of nations don't seem to have been ready to support this course of action, at least not so far?
First, on the sanctions, the United States uses sanctions a lot. It's an interesting policy. They use it a lot because it's without any direct budget outlay, and it can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't require any public debate. It doesn't require any congressional approval. The public doesn't even understand what it is, but who cares? It's not their business. This is purely the president by signing a document. And the U.S. uses these unilateral sanctions. This is different from sanctions approved by the UN. That's a different matter because the Security Council can vote sanctions under the UN Charter. But this is the U.S. using its sanctions, and they do it a lot. The one thing I would observe about this is they almost never work in geopolitical terms. And I've watched for years the use of sanctions by the U.S. as a cheap, easy policy fail time and again. One was the United States, in one of the most ridiculous foreign policy moves you can imagine, suddenly decided under Trump to declare that the president of Venezuela wasn't the president, but the president that the United States said was the president. So the United States one day announced Maduro is not president, Guaido is president. It's in English we would say pretty ballsy. That you just announce one day who the other country's president actually is. It's a strange kind of foreign policy. Anyway, they said, okay, since Maduro's not president, he can't have any access to foreign exchange reserves anymore. He can't Venezuela won't be allowed to fix its oil drilling and so forth. So by stroke of a pen, they put on these unilateral sanctions. It actually worked in one sense. It completely crushed the Venezuelan economy, which declined by more than 50% in GDP, extraordinary decline. What didn't work is Maduro's still there, of course. And Guaido, by the way, was thrown out even by the opposition saying, no, he's not our president anymore. The whole thing was absurd. It was worse than a high school play, actually. Oh, you're not student council president? He is. Yeah, but he won the vote. No, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they did this, but it didn't work geopolitically. It didn't end Maduro's government. In fact, in a way, he said, look, all this economic crisis caused by the gringos in the north, which was pretty accurate description, after all. It was the United States that did this. So now, by the way, the White House sends its emissaries to Maduro. Would you pump more oil because we have to replace the Russian oil? So now they're trying to become buddies with Maduro again. But the point is, it didn't work. And no U.S. sanctions regime that I know of in recent years has come close to working. So that's a starting point. So as soon as the U.S. put on sanctions on Russia, I talked to a very senior official and I said, this isn't going to work. it doesn't work. This time it was worse though, because not only did it not cripple the Russian economy, the boomerang effect, which didn't apply in Venezuela so much, because you could crush Venezuela without the whole world feeling it, applied in the case of Russia, which is it's led to tremendous global negative consequences. So it didn't stop Russia from exporting all over the world. And I'll come to your question, why? But it also hurt Europe a lot, because Europe's told, no, you can't buy the low-cost energy that your industry has built upon. So the effects were quite serious, and we haven't seen the last of those effects yet. But when the sanctions were imposed, it was the US and always the Anglo-Saxon world, so that's the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That's a block of the security system of the US. Then the EU, okay? Then Japan, Korea, and Singapore. That's basically it. That's roughly 20% or so of the world population, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit less, actually. And most of the rest of the world said, we don't want to get into this. We trade with Russia, we trade with Ukraine. We're not party to this conflict. We think this conflict should stop with negotiations. And so most of the world does not want this. Of course, a lot of the world's afraid of the US secondary sanctions, but the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with these sanctions and doesn't even agree with the idea that any country can just decide to impose these sanctions, which are illegal in international law, after all. There's no legal basis for one country to say, stop trading with all those other countries. You can't do that. But they're a little afraid, but they don't impose the sanctions. This is the basic reason why Russian economy has done fine during the past year, because China trades with Russia, India trades with Russia, all the Asian countries trade with Russia, the Latin American countries trade with Russia. Today, Chancellor Scholz has been in South America, and he's being told by the South American leaders, don't pull us into this. We're not going to send arms to Ukraine. They trade with Russia, but they also trade with Ukraine, by the way. They don't want to be in this proxy war. So that's the main reason. And they don't view it like the US thought automatically they would view it, that this is an unprovoked attack. I speak to world leaders all over the world, and they understand full well this is a confrontation of two superpowers, not one side launching a war. And they want both sides to back off. Good afternoon to everybody. And the noise may be coming from my area. It's 6 a.m. where I am in Athens. So I'm in a cafeteria, which is very nicely allowing me to have the video now. And I hope that I can be heard. I want to thank you for inviting me and thank SHAPE for its leadership. And I just had the privilege to listen to Alison Brainovsky and Chung-In Moon. And these are brilliant statements that we've all been treated with. Absolutely insightful. I absolutely agree with all that has been said. The world has gone mad. But especially the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm afraid. I don't know whether there is any sense at all in our little English-speaking corner of the world. I'm, of course, speaking of the United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's something profoundly disheartening about the politics of our countries right now. The deep madness, I'm afraid, is British imperial thinking taken over by the United States. My country, the US, is unrecognizable now compared even to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, who runs the country. I do not believe it is the President of the United States right now. We are run by generals, by our security establishment. The public is privy to nothing. The lies that are told about foreign policy are daily and pervasive by a mainstream media that I can barely listen to or read anymore. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the main television outlets are 100% repeating government propaganda by the day, and it's almost impossible to break through. What is this about? Well, as you've heard, it's about a madness of the United States to keep U.S. hegemony, militarized, dominated by the thinking of generals who are mediocre intellects, personally greedy, and without any sense, because their only modus operandi is to make war. And then cheerled by Britain, which is unfortunately in my adult life increasingly pathetic in being a cheerleader for the United States for this hegemony and for war. Whatever the US says, Britain will say it 10 times more enthusiastically. And it could not love more the war in Ukraine, which is the great second Crimean War for the British media and for the British political leadership. Now, how Australia and New Zealand fall for this idiocy is really a deep question for you, because people should know better, but I'm afraid that it is the Five Eyes and the security establishment that tell the politicians, to the extent that the politicians are involved in this, well, this is how we have to do it. This is our security state. And I don't think our politicians necessarily have much role in this. By the way, the public has no role at all in US foreign policy, at all. We have no debate, no discussion, no deliberation, no debates over voting the 113 billion, but in fact much more money spent on the Ukraine war so far. There's not been an hour of organized debate, even in the Congress, on this, much less in the public. But my guess is that your security establishment is really the driver of this. And then they explain to the Prime Minister and to the others, this is the utmost national security, and this is what America has told us, and let me explain what we're seeing. And of course, you cannot divulge this to the broader public, but this is at the essence of the struggle for survival in the world. Everything I see myself, I'm 43 years in this activity as an economic advisor all over the world, is nonsense. And one thing that would be interesting for people to look at to understand these developments is a very telling article by a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Robert Blackwell, and Ashley Tellis, written for the Council on Foreign Relations about 8 years ago now. I just want to read a couple excerpts from it, because it laid out the whole plan of what's happening right now pretty directly, which is how things work in the US, which is through the establishment media, you're basically told in not necessarily completely explicit terms what's going to happen, because what is unfolding right now is really part of a longer term planned agenda. It's not ad hoc. So here's what Blackwell and Tellis wrote in 2015. First, quote, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." And then argues that this goal of primacy ought to remain the central objective of US grand strategy in the 21st century. So what's the goal? The goal is very straightforward. It is primacy of the United States globally. Then Blackwell and Tellis lay out the game plan for China. So they tell us what to do. Here's the list. I'm only excerpting. Quote, "Create new preferential trading arrangements among US friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China." Okay, this is the game that already Obama started with TPP. He couldn't get it through, but I'll go on and then I'll comment. Second, create a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, to build up, quote, "power political capacities of US friends and allies on China's periphery," and strengthen US military forces along the Asian rimlands, despite any Chinese opposition. What I find remarkable about this is this was a list made in 2015. It's exactly the step-by-step plan of action. This is repeated in recent history. In 1997's Big Brzezinski, in an article in Foreign Affairs, laid out exactly the timeline for NATO enlargement and the intention to include Ukraine in NATO enlargement, because this was already the security establishment plan. Of course, it's led us directly to the Ukraine war, which is a war over NATO enlargement. Now the friends that have, and the geniuses that have brought the world the Ukraine war, want to bring the war to your neighborhood with, as Professor Moon said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization starting to open its offices in Asia, which is not exactly the North Atlantic. So this is where we are. It's not absolutely simple to see through for one main reason. At least in the US, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I expect that it's the same. We have no honesty or discussion at all about this. The policies are owned entirely by the security establishment, the military-industrial complex, the network of, quote, think tanks, which are non-think tanks in Washington, every one of which is funded by the military-industrial complex. They've taken over the East Coast universities entirely, where I teach. I taught 20 years at Harvard. I teach at Columbia University. This is our milieu right now. And the silent coup happened in essence. No debate, no public politics, no honesty, no documents revealed, everything secret, everything confidential, and mysterious moves. And since I happen to be an economist that engages with heads of state around the world, I hear a lot of things. And so I've seen and heard a lot of things directly, which help me to understand the lies every day. But you will not find any of this in our public discourse. Just a word about the Ukraine war. Completely predictable and part of a plan of action that goes back to the early 1990s to essentially bring Ukraine into the US military orbit. And Brzezinski, again in 1997 in the Global Chessboard, his geopolitical book, laid it out completely. Russia without Ukraine is nothing. Ukraine is the geographical pivot for Eurasia, and basically go get it. Interestingly, Brzezinski said in 1997 in the book, but the one thing absolutely American policymakers need to ensure is that they don't push Russia and China into an alliance together. But then he says, that's pretty much unthinkable. You know, don't worry about that, but that would be the craziest thing in the world. And it's exactly what these crazy people have done. I happen to have been an advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin, and to Kuchma in the early days of both the late days of perestroika and the early days after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I watched very closely what was happening. I saw that the United States was absolutely uninterested in any way in helping Russia to stabilize. The idea from the start was unipolarity, keep Russia down, and take steps already decided in 1992, basically, in direct contradiction to what had been told to Gorbachev and Yeltsin to start expanding NATO. So this is a game plan with a long horizon. When it comes to China, and by the way, the US was deeply implicated in the overthrow of Ukraine's president in 2014. It was a coup. It was to an important extent a regime change operation of the United States, not entirely, but to a very significant extent. I happened to see part of it in a very weird way up close, and I know how US money poured into supporting the Maidan, and it was incredibly disgusting and very unnerving, and Putin noticed that the US contributed to the overthrow of a friendly government next door, in the context of the explicit intention to push NATO, by the way, not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia. And when one looks at the map, it's Brzezinski's idea: surround Russia in the Black Sea region. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all be members of NATO. That would be the end of Russian power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So go these geniuses. And Putin gave many opportunities for negotiation out of this. The Minsk agreements endorsed by the UN Security Council in 2021, December 17, he put on the table perfectly reasonable document for negotiation, the draft US-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO expansion. The US blew it off. I called the White House after that was put on the table, spoke to one of our top security officials, and said, negotiate. Stop the NATO enlargement. You have a chance to avoid war. The United States' formal response to Putin was, NATO is non-negotiable. This is something only between the US and Ukraine, and Russia has no say in NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It's a mind-boggling way to pursue foreign affairs because it is a direct road to war. As you know, I hope everybody understands, this war in Ukraine was close to ending in March 2022 with a negotiated agreement a month after Russia invaded on February 24th, with an agreement between Ukraine and Russia that the United States stopped because the US said, fight on, don't negotiate, don't accept neutrality. And so here we are in a war that continues to escalate towards possible nuclear war, which is what would happen if Russia were to suffer deep defeats on the battlefield. It's not doing that right now. It's not experiencing that. But if it did, it just escalates to nuclear war. Russia is not going to be defeated, pushed out of Crimea, and go home meekly and saying, we're sorry we did that. It's going to escalate if it needs to escalate. So we are right now in a spiral that is extremely dangerous. Japan plays utterly into this. And Australia, it's so sad to watch Australia in a accepting to be used in this reckless way, to pay a fortune to be used in this reckless and provocative way. And US actions, by and large, till now, with very few exceptions, US actions are putting us on a path to war with China in the same way that US actions did in Ukraine. Only this war, well, but either war could end everything. But the whole idea of the US and its allies fighting China is mind-boggling in its implications, in its stupidity, in its profound dangers, and in its utter divorce from real security interests and from reality, because China is not a threat to Australia. It is not a threat to the world. And last time I looked, correct me because there's some experts in the room, many more than I, but I don't know of a single overseas Chinese invasion in its history, by the way, other than on the borders. I don't know in its whole history, except when the Mongols briefly ruled China and tried to invade Japan. Other than the Mongol invasion, defeated by a typhoon, other than that, I don't know of another single case in 2,200 years of Chinese statecraft. So this is not exactly at the top of my worry list. This is what worries me about the world is a deeply neurotic United States that aims to be number one, that can't be number one in the way that it self-believes to be number one, that has a pathetic, and I'm sorry to use the term, but it is pathetic, cheerleader in London every day saying how wonderful it is. Empire is great. You should go try it. We love it.
Jeffrey,
yeah, I'm going to stop here. Sorry to go on and on, but let me just, if I could, 1 minute to say what should be done. The war in Ukraine could end the day after Biden steps up and says NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. Believe it. The basis for negotiation has been there for 20 years and rejected by the US. Second, the idea of opening NATO offices in Asia is mind-boggling in its risk and its stupidity. And please tell the Japanese, stop this. It's reckless. Third, the US approach to Taiwan, except in a glimmer of reality of Blinken last month, is profoundly dangerous, provocative, and deliberately so. Fourth, what is needed is regional dialogue in Asia, among Asians and among the Asia Pacific. And fifth, use RCEP, because RCEP is actually the correct concept for the region, to bring together China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand in a coherent framework, especially around the climate challenge, energy policy, trade policy, investment policy, would do a world of good, not only for the 15 in the Asia Pacific, but for the entire world. Sorry to have run on so long and to ramble, but it's so important what SHAPE is doing. You're completely on the right track, and all best wishes to your efforts. It's amazing. It's not only in the UK media. If you look at the US press, the delight, the gloating over China's purported difficulties fill the pages. And this recent issue of Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, just across the park from where I am, and is the kind of center of the American establishment, is just filled with end of China stories. Of course, a few months ago it was China about to take over everything stories. This is an elite that talks to itself in circles and with utter confusion, but also a lot of dissimulation. What's happening with China is, of course, complicated. It's by some measures the world's largest economy, by other measures the second largest economy, but it's big and it's complex, so many things are happening. But one of the things that definitely is happening is the United States is doing everything it can to try to derail the Chinese economy. It claims, of course, it isn't, but it is. And as you mentioned, we've been through this before. Of course, the whole Cold War non-military side of the US vis-a-vis the Soviet Union was about economic and technological containment. That was the core organizing idea. And that playbook was used, ironically, against America's ally, Japan, in the 1980s. And it's a period I remember well because I started as an assistant professor in economics at Harvard in 1980. And I went on my first visit to Japan in 1981. And I went with a wonderful colleague, Ezra Vogel, who had written a book which was the Japanese bestseller of the time called Japan as Number One. And Japan as Number One was about the surge of Japanese manufacturing, Sony and Toyota and so forth. And it said Japan has developed a lot of remarkable process improvements, just-in-time manufacturing and so forth. And it was now a dominant manufacturing power. And of course, it was not only in consumer electronics, but increasingly in semiconductors and other cutting-edge technologies. And this was a celebratory mood of Japan in the 1980s. And one could watch, and I watched it close up, how American policymakers, wait a minute, this is an ally that's supposed to be subservient to us. Now it's taking our industry. And by the second half of the 1980s, all this American rhetoric and supposed ideology of the liberal order and so forth, of course, was turned on its head. We need to stop Japan. We need to stop Japan's economy, but we can't do it in just those terms. Japan's a bulwark of our power in East Asia, so we have to do it by agreement. And in the late 1980s, the agreement was Japan would stop exporting to the United States, even though it was hyper-competitive vis-a-vis the United States. And the Plaza Agreement that you recall rightly was an agreement that Japan would massively overvalue its currency. Kind of a remarkable idea, but the Japanese yen soared in value, but by design. This was a policy of the United States. The US also imposed many export limits on Japan, and these were called voluntary because Japan, as being a part of the US security system, accepted them and said, we won't export to the United States automobiles or semiconductors and so forth. And by the end of the 1980s, Japanese growth had stopped. But it had stopped absolutely because the United States had stopped it. And Japan, in its way, had acceded to that in public. So the public rhetoric was, well, Japan's entering a recession. The behind the scenes, of course, was the United States had engineered the stop of Japan's relentless manufacturing success. And Japan went into a financial crisis because finance is based on extrapolation. So asset prices are based on extrapolating the rapid growth into the future. And when Japan's rapid growth into the future was no longer rapid, then asset prices collapsed. And in 1990, 1991, 1992, we had the so-called bursting of the Japanese bubble. And Japan went into a long and prolonged crisis. And the US policymakers said, well, Japan's aggregate demand is down, meaning it wasn't selling exports anymore. That was the US policy. Japan should increase its consumption and stop bothering us, basically, with the exports. And I had a very interesting and distinct conversation with one of Japan's top economic policymakers in the mid-1990s, who was a friend and very senior, let's just say. And I said, why don't you weaken the currency? You know, your exports have completely stalled. You have a lack of growth. Japan's no longer competitive. And he looked at me and he said, Jeff, the US won't let us do it. Okay, this is clear, it's kind of obvious, but never said. What is said in the history books is Japan had a balance sheet recession. Japan had a bursting of a bubble. But Japan faced geopolitics straight away. And because Japan was under the US thumb, it never publicly complained. Recently, I was in Japan speaking with one of Japan's most knowledgeable, very, very senior policymakers. And we were recounting this episode in agreement of interpretation. And I said something about how in the economics profession, the so-called balance sheet recession view, that this was about finance and Japan's overextension and bubble had taken hold. And watching him roll his eyes at how ridiculous the normal account was extremely entertaining and very telling for me. So to bring us up to date, China is Japanifying. In fact, that's a term that is being widely bandied about. Oh, China has a big debt crisis. China's no longer as competitive as it was. Big surprise. China is this, China's that, all the weaknesses of the Chinese system. But what's happening in a very concerted way since around 2015 is the United States is doing everything it can to derail China's economic growth. The same playbook. The big difference is China's not under the US security thumb. Everything else is the same. So there isn't a Plaza agreement where China agrees to a massive overvaluation of the renminbi, but there was the Trump tariffs, unilateral, absolutely against World Trade Organization precepts, but of course, WTO rules don't matter to the so-called rule-based order, which is whatever the rules that the United States wants is in fact what the rule-based order means. So the US started this process of the old playbook, the Soviet containment playbook, the Japan containment playbook, now with China. And it's doing it through a mix of policies, not with Chinese agreement, but unilateral tariffs, other blockades on the markets, tax cuts and subsidies with the rules of origin for the US side to say you can't produce in the US or can't get the tax breaks unless it's US based, rules to stop China's inward investment into the US, rules to stop US outward investment to China, and most tellingly now, trying to break China's access to high technology. the rhetoric of all of this is, oh, we're not doing anything against China. This is very narrow. This is a high wall on a small yard. And to paraphrase Jake Sullivan, this is completely to play with fire by trying to stop China's growth. And now we see this year, China's overall growth has slowed tremendously. And the most telling factor, the single biggest factor, is not all the things that are said about the debt markets and real estate. The biggest single factor is China's exports to the US and to the European allies are way down this year because the barriers are going way up. And the barriers are the direct barriers, the warnings to US companies. You better friendshore, you better reshore, you better move away from China in your supply chains. We don't want to see you dealing with China right now. And this is having an effect. What's completely fascinating, though, and this week was the mark of it, is China is not Japan. China is not subservient to the United States. China is much bigger than the Japanese economy, both in absolute terms and relative to the US. And arguably, it's larger than the US economy in absolute size, or second to the US economy. But it's got a lot of friends around the world that also don't want the US hegemony in the global system. And that was the, I think, rather remarkable note of this week's BRICS summit, which you've been discussing at length. I think it was actually a rather remarkable summit. Not only are the existing 5 BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, already larger in size than the G7 when measured at international prices or purchasing power prices, but they added 6 more systemically consequential countries. And rather fascinating, because Brazil took its biggest next door neighbor, Argentina, so that really is solidifying the South American base of this anti-US hegemonic response. They brought in, very interestingly, Egypt and Ethiopia, meaning that it's the northeast corner of Africa and the Indian Ocean side. And these are 2 very, very interesting large countries with more than 110 million people each. And then the Gulf region, of course. And remarkably, China's absolutely stupendous diplomatic success, Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as the Emirates as the remaining 3. So the BRICS agreed to expand by another 400 million people, another 5% or so of the world GDP. The BRICS countries in the expanded form will be significantly larger than the G7. And what was quite fascinating for me as a monetary economist is the amount of focus on really making a complete workaround from the US dollar, because that's the real point that they're saying, given that the US government very unwisely, self-defeatingly, completely armed and militarized the dollar in the last 10 years, so that the currency is not just a settlements account, it's an instrument of hegemony. And now there's this massive counter reaction to that I think is going to be extraordinarily consequential. So in short, we're seeing a replay of this deep American hegemonic impulse, but I think we're seeing it in a way that it can't succeed. And this week may be exactly that historic moment where the U.S. power essentially peaked and the anti-hegemonic group of nations, which is very large in the world, by the way. It's not just the 5 BRICS or now the 11 with the 6 new members. It's dozens and dozens of countries that do not want to see one country dominate the world system. Well, it's like the United States. What is democracy right now? It's a game of narratives and propaganda. So I think it's a shame. It's very sad what's happening right now. And the result is war in Ukraine, in which tens of thousands of people are being killed actually every month now. And this is going on because the U.S. security state insists on it, and we know that just about every politician in Western Europe feels that you can't cross the United States because European security depends on it. There's been almost a complete elimination of the line between the European Union, which is a political and economic construction, and NATO. And it's not an accident that the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are in Brussels. I think it's a sad fact that Europe lost its way by confusing this military alliance, which is a US-led construction, with the political, cultural, social, and economic grouping of Europe, which is an aim to get the best of more than 2,000 years of culture in Europe. But now they're all confused. And I know that the European leaders simply will not cross the White House. Truly, I don't understand why, because none of this is in Europe's real interest. And many European leaders know better. But they're not talking. And what's happening in the media in Slovakia is happening all over the regions dominated by the U.S. And people are afraid. People are afraid of the United States government. People are afraid of the security state. People say, well, that's where our bread is buttered, or that's where our incomes come from, or that is where our security comes from, so we're not going to cross that. But it's terrible, because if people would understand recent history, what is this U.S. security state? It's the one that brought 20 years of destruction to Afghanistan. It's the one that brought the Iraq War. It's the one that destabilized Syria. It's the one that destabilized Libya. And it's the one that destabilized Ukraine, by the way. So people should see it with their own eyes. It's too bad. I want my country to do better, but I would have expected other countries to look at the facts as they are.
How do you think the conflict in Ukraine is developing, and how will it end?
Well, I think Ukraine is getting destroyed. I said at the beginning of this that the United States was going to turn Ukraine into Europe's Afghanistan. What did I mean by that? The United States went into Afghanistan in 1979. President Carter ordered the CIA to start funding the jihadists to try to overthrow the Afghan government. That was 44 years ago. And look at the result. The U.S. turned Afghanistan into a 40-year battlefield. And then one day it just left, because that's also the U.S. way. Same happened in Vietnam and in many other places. The whole thing with the U.S. is plenty of weapons, but as long as the U.S. isn't fighting there, they're content to keep sending weapons and keep having bloodshed. What's sad is that the Ukrainians are, for some reason, party to this. The Ukrainian leadership, we don't know what the Ukrainian people feel, because it's martial law, there's no elections, there's no asking. Now Zelensky said mobilization of every male in the society, are they really going to just continue to throw away the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people for NATO enlargement? I don't know.
The American think tank Rand Corporation released a report on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. The United States and several Western European companies want to participate very actively in the restoration of Ukraine. You worked in Ukraine in the 1990s. You were an advisor during several transformations in Eastern European economies. How do you think is it possible to prevent this recovery from ending with the sale of Ukrainian companies?
No one is going to rescue Ukraine, believe me. There's going to be no Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There's going to be no hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is all fantasy world, period.
And my last question, Mr. Professor, what is your explanation for the fact overall the sanctions did not put the Russian economy on hold? The war and sanctions are growing by less than 2%. According to the World Bank, Russia's economy is now the strongest in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. How is it possible?
Because most of the world does not agree with the US and European Union. Shockingly, the Americans and Europeans don't understand this because our media don't tell the truth. But my job is to work all over the world, mainly in the developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Central Asia. Nobody believes in the official story that this is unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Everybody knows this is about the US and Russia, NATO enlargement, US power. This is what people know. So governments around the world didn't stop doing business with Russia. That's it. If they had, the sanctions would have had a much bigger effect. But Russia's actively trading all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over Africa. And the sanctions regime is just the US, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, Singapore. That's it. And the rest of the world is doing its business. And our media can't understand this because their job is to report the US government narrative, which is that the whole world is united against Russia. Well, nonsense. This is exactly why these sanctions didn't work. By the way, the sanctions didn't work for a simple reason, which is not only does most of the world want to continue to have normal economic relations with Russia, but it's not so hard to have arrangements that don't involve U.S. banks. You just use other people's banks. That's the story. And so settling in rubles or settling in renminbi or settling in some other currency is not rocket science. It's just if you're not a friend of the United States, keep your money out of U.S. dollars because they may take the money away. That's the lesson. And so Russia's now dealing in non-dollar transactions.
For last 3 years, you are being consulted because of the COVID, because of the Ukraine war, etc. But predominantly you are an economist, yes? So we would like to take advantage of your economist knowledge. And you quite often mention that there's the de-dollarization threat, that it's clear that the de-dollarization will happen. So the question is, especially in the terms of huge United States inner debt, what will be the causes of de-dollarization for the United States? And what are the causes of de-dollarization for the Western economics which are closely joined, which really depend on the United States economy?
I think there are two different issues for people to understand. One is the so-called real economy, what different parts of the world produce, the technologies that they have, the trade in goods and services, the innovations. And the second is the financial side, how transactions are made, in which currency, in which institutions, banks, or through the internet, and so forth. And the point that I'm making broadly is that on the second dimension, the role of the dollar will diminish over time for two main reasons. One is that it's not safe for any country that is not in good foreign relations with the United States to keep its reserves in dollars, because the U.S. has basically militarized the dollar. If you're an enemy of the United States, the U.S. will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves in Venezuela, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia. So the United States didn't say, oh, we protect the property rights, we may have disagreements, but we protect the property. Quite the contrary. The United States said, we're freezing all of Russia's financial assets. And not just that, quite interestingly, if you're a friend of Putin, whatever that means, I don't know what that means in a court of law, but we're going to take your apartments, we'll take your financial assets, we'll freeze your bank accounts. It's really amazing to me because the United States is supposed to be the place that protects property rights. So the first thing is that lots of governments, especially the governments not friendly with the United States, are trying to find a different way to settle transactions, and they're smart to do so. The second thing that's happening is that the normal way in general of settling transactions, which is through banks, is going to diminish because of digital currencies, because of the ability to have central bank digital currencies. I think this will make a big difference. It's only at the beginning, so it's a little bit hard to say the timing, but I do believe that there will be direct settlements using basically central bank direct settlement mechanisms rather than going through commercial banks, which is much more laborious. But we went through banks for hundreds of years because that was the only alternative. Now with the internet and with all of the paraphernalia around digital finance, we can do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, if the demilitarization of dollar happened under different administrative, under different president, do you think that that dollarization can slow down, the dollar can remain the bad first-class currency for other tens or hundreds of years?
Not for hundreds of years, certainly, but there is normally a very gradual change in settlements processes because of network externalities, so-called, which means people use dollars because other people use dollars. So the dollar has a certain staying power. The U.S. is wrecking it by its foreign policy right now. It's shocking to me how they're taking measures that are directly wounding the role of the dollar, because I wouldn't have done at all what the U.S. government has done in freezing assets and seizing assets and so forth. But still, the dollar remains because there's a lot of infrastructure. There is the big network. There is a lot of financial expertise. But the U.S. is also, over time, declining as a share of the world economy. The sterling, the pound sterling, was the dollar of the 19th century. It was unthinkable that there would be anything other than the pound sterling. Now, what's the pound sterling? It's a footnote in history. It's still used in Britain, but who cares? It plays basically no role in the international system. And someday that will be the situation with the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. is only 4% of the world population. So can't really be the center of the world the way that American strategists want it to be and believe it to be. But the dollar could remain for quite a while, not on our current policy though.
Well, let's discuss the BRIC, because BRIC, and it's nearly forgotten right now, was created as the toy, as the mental toy of Western academics. First of all, it used to be just an acronym in 2001. But now it's emancipated, it's strong, it seems to be the new economic integration, and there are some discussions about the enlargement of that. So first of all, do you think that Western academics really intend to create this very self-confidence integration? And secondly, do you think that it can be really enlarged unless it was harmed by the enlargement?
Originally, the BRICS was the idea that, boy, there's a lot of good places to invest in a diversified portfolio because you have these emerging economies and they're growing, they're adopting technologies. So it was a Goldman Sachs invention, not a Jeffrey Sachs invention, but the bank Goldman Sachs. It was basically a reflection of the emergence of the emerging markets. But then it became political. The BRICS started to meet with each other, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, why? Because they had one major thing in common other than being emerging economies, and that was they didn't want the U.S. as the hegemonic power. It was really annoying for all of them to have the United States say, we're the world leader, we're the sole superpower, we're the indispensable country, we make the rules-based system. Which rules? Our rules. So that's what united the BRICS, was annoyance, actually, with the arrogance of U.S. liberal hegemonists or neocons. They made the BRICS. Actually, even it's interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very clever strategist for the U.S. power, wrote, when he wrote The Global Chessboard in 1997, he said the one unthinkable thing is for the U.S. to push Russia and China together. But because of American arrogance, that's exactly what America did every day, step by step, for the next 25 years. And that's what made the BRICS. And I think that's what basically unites the BRICS. On the one side, they're united because, well, they're important economies, and the BRICS are now larger than the G7 in purchasing power measured terms. So that's a big deal. But I think the other thing is geopolitical, which is the BRICS really say, we're big powers. We want a multipolar world. We don't want the U.S. surrounding us with military bases. That's the Russian view. That is the Chinese view. Brazil says, come on, don't interfere in South America the way you do, saying we're going to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which was another stupid U.S. idea of the last 10 years. And so Brazil, in a different way, because it's not a superpower like China or Russia, it's not a nuclear power, but it still says, give some space to our region. We don't want the U.S. dictating to us. China's quite interesting because China triangulates. I don't mean China, sorry, India. India's quite interesting because India really triangulates. They have their tensions, even border disputes, of course, with between India and China. And the United States says, okay, we'll be your partner. You just have to oppose China. But India is also, of course, a great civilization. It was colonized by Britain for centuries. And it's not about to say, yes, United States, you run the world. So India fits in this mold in a very interesting way as well, basically as the world's most populous country that wants to have its global say. So what the BRICS really represent is the call for multipolarity as opposed to a US-led world. Europe somehow just wanted to duck under the under the blanket, and have the U.S. protection, which is very surprising to me because Europe has been very naive in recent years, especially regarding Ukraine. It's accepted huge economic costs without any strategic thinking because the U.S. said so, and we'll see how that evolves.
Seen from the West or Western Europe or probably even the United States, the BRICS seems to be nowadays something as the black box. So now there's minimum of contact between the Western academic sphere and BRICS universities, minimum contact between the Ministry of Finance, central banks, etc. You've mentioned the Goldman Sachs, probably even JP Morgan and the others. Can you see some attempts of infiltration of these old Bretton Woods organizations, old banks, houses, as they wanted to infiltrate the BRICS institutions, the BRICS academic circles, because BRICS now really wants to be the number one, yeah? So I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs wouldn't try to be in close, deep touch on this process.
Well, look, the Wall Street very much has a presence and wants an even bigger presence in China. It wants a presence in India and so on. Russia is another matter because stupidly for the moment, all economic connections were lost and cut, which is a shame. I believe they'll come back because you can't just close your eyes and say that a country of 11 time zones and a nuclear superpower doesn't exist, but that's the attitude right now. In fact, there's lots of connection. Where the breakdown is occurring is at the political level. The companies would like to have ongoing normal relations with China, but the United States is saying, no, we have to go into a containment mode. We're going to scrutinize your investments. If a U.S. company invests in China, it's considered unpatriotic or maybe threatening U.S. security. This is the change, really. And there's lots of interchange over the last 30 years between U.S. and Chinese scholars and lots of Chinese students studying in the United States and Europe, but the U.S. is cutting that too. All of this is bad for the U.S. and Europe. All of this fear, protectionism, hostility is an own goal. It's a self-imposed cost, but it comes from this U.S. idea that either we're number one or we're going to fight to stop you from being so powerful, and it's leading to a very tense breakdown of relations that existed and that still exist to an important extent, but are now under a very dark cloud. And so if you have good relations with China, oh, the eyebrows are raised in the United States. What are you doing? Something improper, and so on. And Europe is increasingly playing with this, which is ridiculous because Europe and China are partners in Eurasia. Europe and China have every reason to cooperate with each other, to trade with each other. The Silk routes are not an imaginary idea. They go back 2,000 years, east-west trade. And but Europe is parroting, or at least Brussels is parroting the U.S. line right now. And the U.S. idea of NATO expanding to East Asia, I have to put as the number one dumbest idea that I've heard. You know, for NATO to open an office in Tokyo, for example. What are we possibly thinking? And how could Europe, which is filled with such intelligent people, ever go along with this idea? I don't know.
Probably the last question. There's a wide discussion about the BRICS currency unit, new currency unit, artificial currency unit. Is there something that the BRICS, as the integration can get inspired by Euro, by special drawing rights, probably how to avoid the mistakes and the deep errors of them. What should be the design of such unit?
I doubt that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon, but what I do believe is that there will be a non-dollar, non-euro settlements system that the BRICS countries will use. Maybe they'll settle a lot in renminbi, maybe they'll settle in Indian rupees, they will settle some in rubles, they may establish financial institutions with extensive swap lines between the central banks, kind of a quasi-IMF that would help to ensure liquidity among the trading partners within the BRICS and a broader network. But a single currency, I doubt it. One could say, by the way, that there could be something like a BRICS SDR, which is a unit of account. It's a basket. It can serve certain purposes, but it's not really a settlements currency, and it's not really an active transactions currency. So one could imagine something like that, but I don't think we're going to see an actual currency that you can look at or hold in your account that's and use for transactions that's a BRICS currency anytime soon. Maybe I'm out of date and it's going to happen faster, but I think it'll be much more likely that, excuse me, on our phones we'll be able to settle in renminbi, or we'll be able to settle in rupees or reales rather than a single BRICS currency.